Saturday afternoons have always been my favorite time to slow down. I make coffee, sit by the window, and watch whatever happens to be on television. Most weekends I never look for anything specific. Sometimes the most interesting stories appear when you aren't searching for them at all. The documentary began with campaign footage recorded decades earlier, long before this politician became a familiar public figure. The neighborhood looked ordinary. The house looked ordinary. Even the car felt like something you'd pass without noticing twice. I wasn't sure why, but I replayed that moment once more. Something about its simplicity refused to leave my mind. Then I saw the very same person years later, standing before world leaders with cameras following every single movement. Success itself wasn't unusual. What surprised me was how dramatically this person's life appeared to have completely changed. The more examples I noticed, the less this felt like one person's story and the more it resembled a pattern. Maybe I was missing something obvious. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation hiding behind those very different pictures. One question stayed with me long after the television was off. How does an ordinary career become extraordinary wealth? Instead of searching for opinions, I decided to search for facts. The internet had plenty of both, but only one mattered. The more I clicked, the more complicated the story became. Every website seemed to describe a different version of the same person. Television focused on speeches and policies, but almost nobody seemed interested in explaining the remarkable financial transformation itself. The question followed me long after I left my apartment. Somehow the answer felt both obvious and completely hidden. Millions of people work their entire lives without becoming exceptionally wealthy. So what makes this path look so different? Wealth usually follows businesses, investments, or innovation. Politics didn't seem to fit naturally into that familiar equation. Before believing any conclusion, I wanted to separate documented facts from stories people simply repeated without questioning. Headlines were designed to attract attention. Evidence, on the other hand, usually lived somewhere far less exciting. Maybe the answer wasn't hidden because it was secret. Maybe it was hidden because almost nobody bothered looking carefully. That's when I realized the investigation wouldn't begin with rumors. It would begin with documents that anyone could access. I expected hidden information behind passwords. Instead, the records were sitting on a government website, available for anyone willing to read them. There were disclosure forms, asset declarations, and election filings. None of them looked exciting until I started reading carefully. At first glance, every document seemed ordinary. Together, however, they began telling a much larger story than any headline ever could. The oldest records became just as important as the newest ones, because wealth rarely appears overnight without leaving a trail. Some records existed only on paper, quietly stored inside filing cabinets that almost nobody had opened in years. The more pages I read, the more I realized this investigation wasn't about finding secrets. It was about connecting scattered pieces. Individual documents answered very little. Placing them together in order suddenly revealed relationships I hadn't noticed before. Everything I needed had been publicly available from the very beginning. The difficult part was knowing where to look. Slowly, disconnected documents began forming a single picture, replacing assumptions with evidence collected one page at a time. One detail stood out immediately. The official salary explained only part of the story, which meant the next question became unavoidable. Politicians do earn salaries, but something told me that salary alone couldn't explain everything I was looking at. The numbers didn't seem impossible. They simply didn't appear large enough to match the wealth some people eventually accumulated. Then I noticed something unexpected. Many politicians weren't earning money from politics alone after all. Book deals had become another source of income, sometimes generating millions of dollars long after an election had ended. Speaking at conferences could also become surprisingly valuable, especially for people whose names carried national recognition. Then another thought crossed my mind. Money rarely stays still. Once accumulated, it often begins generating even more money. Investments, dividends, and appreciating assets could quietly multiply wealth for years without attracting much public attention. Sometimes wealth isn't created overnight. Sometimes it's passed between generations, growing quietly long before anyone notices. The picture was becoming much more complicated than I'd expected. Politics appeared to be only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The salary explained one stream of income. Everything else suggested I needed to follow every source of wealth, not just one. The more I followed the money, the more I noticed something else growing alongside it. Relationships. These weren't random meetings. The same influential faces seemed to appear together again and again at different events. Influence doesn't always happen behind closed doors. Sometimes it begins with nothing more than an introduction over coffee. Fundraising events brought together people with very different goals, yet everyone seemed interested in building new relationships. Money wasn't changing hands in front of me. Access was. And sometimes access becomes more valuable than money itself. The same names kept crossing paths in airports, conferences, and meetings long after election campaigns had ended. One meeting meant very little. 5 different meetings involving the same people began looking much more meaningful. Wealth seemed to create opportunity, but opportunity also seemed to create even more valuable relationships. I slowly stopped looking at individuals and started looking at the networks connecting them all together. Maybe influence wasn't simply a consequence of wealth. Maybe influence itself had quietly become one of the most valuable assets. The more I looked at the connections, the less this seemed like a story about money. It was becoming a story about people. Every new relationship seemed to create another opportunity, and every opportunity introduced someone new into the network. These events weren't just places where speeches happened. They were places where long-term relationships quietly began. Most of the important conversations never happened on stage. They happened afterward, away from the audience. Introductions have value because they open doors that would otherwise remain completely closed to most people. The conference ended, but the relationships didn't. They simply continued somewhere else, on another flight or at another meeting. Once I started paying attention, the same names appeared together surprisingly often across completely different events. Access isn't something you can easily measure, but it might be one of the most valuable assets a person can possess. The investigation had quietly changed. I was no longer following money alone. I was following relationships that created opportunity. If relationships create opportunities, then what kinds of opportunities become available to people with extraordinary influence? Even after leaving office, many politicians continue receiving invitations because influence rarely disappears when a term officially ends. Public office may end, but reputation often becomes something entirely different. It becomes a personal brand with lasting value. Book launches weren't simply celebrating new publications. They were also creating another stream of income built on public recognition. The audience wasn't buying paper and ink. They were buying access to someone's experience, reputation, and public identity. Universities, conferences, and organizations willingly pay for people whose experience carries influence beyond the political world. Companies don't always seek political power directly. Sometimes they're simply paying for knowledge, experience, and valuable perspectives. None of these income sources automatically suggested wrongdoing. Most existed completely within legal and transparent professional arrangements. Influence creates invitations, and invitations often create opportunities that simply never appear for the average person. The picture was becoming clearer. Wealth wasn't coming from one source. It was growing through multiple opportunities connected together. The more influence someone gained, the more opportunities seemed to appear. That pattern was becoming impossible for me to ignore. By now, I wasn't asking whether politicians could become wealthy. I was asking how influence kept creating entirely new opportunities. Every answer uncovered another question, and every question pushed the investigation further than I originally expected. Then I noticed another word appearing repeatedly whenever politicians and business were discussed: lobbying. Some people described lobbying as corruption, while others insisted it was an essential part of every healthy democracy. The more opinions I heard, the more I realized those two words were often treated as though they meant the same thing. So instead of listening to opinions, I decided to begin where every complicated question should begin, with the law. The legal definitions were far more detailed than the headlines I'd been reading throughout the investigation. Influence itself wasn't illegal. In many countries, it was openly recognized and carefully regulated by law. Problems usually appeared when legal influence crossed ethical boundaries, or when transparency began quietly disappearing from public view. The investigation had reached its most complicated point. Understanding wealth now meant understanding where legal opportunity ends and ethical questions begin. I quickly realized the law wasn't written in black and white. Most situations existed somewhere in the gray areas between. Courts don't decide cases based on suspicion. They decide them using evidence, legal definitions, and documented facts. Conflict of interest doesn't always mean corruption. Sometimes it simply means personal interests could influence public decisions. That's exactly why many democracies require disclosure rules, to help the public understand where those interests might exist. Good reporting doesn't begin with accusations. It begins with documents, interviews, and carefully verified information. Outside government buildings, most people weren't debating legal definitions. They were simply asking whether the system felt fair. Then I realized something important. Public trust depends just as much on perception as it does on proven facts. I'd spent days following salaries, assets, relationships, and influence, yet something still felt incomplete. Until then, I'd mostly been following income. Maybe it was finally time to start following the assets themselves. Sometimes money disappears without leaving much evidence. Assets, however, often leave records that can survive for decades. Unlike cash, valuable assets tend to leave footprints. Houses, land, and companies usually exist somewhere in the public record. Owning an expensive property doesn't prove anything by itself. It simply raises another question worth understanding. Property records often reveal when an asset was purchased, who owns it, and sometimes even how ownership has changed. Some properties stayed with the same owner for decades, while others quietly changed hands through different legal entities. Wealth isn't always stored in bank accounts. It often lives inside appreciating assets that become more valuable over time. Sometimes people become wealthier without earning dramatically more money, simply because the assets they own keep appreciating. Time can quietly become one of the most powerful wealth-building tools, especially when valuable assets are held for decades. The investigation slowly shifted from following income to understanding how different assets work together to create long-term wealth. Individual assets explained very little on their own. Together, however, they revealed how wealth could gradually compound over decades. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Following assets often revealed far more than following money ever could. Following assets answered one question, but it quietly introduced another. Who actually benefits from all this influence? Money and influence seem to move in circles where business and politics constantly crossed paths. Politicians made decisions. Businesses responded. Sometimes the relationship looked surprisingly close. Every major policy creates winners, losers, and people trying to predict which will come next. Influence rarely happens during dramatic moments. More often, it grows through ordinary conversations repeated over many years. Conferences weren't just places to exchange ideas. They were places where relationships quietly became opportunities. The more I mapped the relationships, the less this looked like a story about individual people. It was becoming a story about networks. Wealth wasn't always following power. Sometimes power itself seemed to create entirely new opportunities for wealth. The connections didn't end when the meeting was over. They simply continued somewhere else, often across another city or another country. By now it was becoming obvious that influence and opportunity rarely stayed in one place. They traveled together. Wealth creates opportunities, but opportunities can also create even greater influence. The relationship works in both directions. I had been treating them as separate ideas, when in reality they often reinforce one another over many years. Political decisions influence markets, while economic success can increase political influence. Neither operates completely on its own. Businesses naturally pay close attention to governments because policies can shape industries, investments, and future opportunities. Different people entered the room with different objectives, yet everyone understood the value of building lasting relationships. Some opportunities begin with contracts. Others begin with nothing more than a conversation that opens another door. The investigation no longer looked like a chain of events. It looked like a cycle that kept reinforcing itself. The more I zoomed out, the less this seemed like one politician's story. It looked like a much broader system. Perhaps wealth wasn't the destination at all. Perhaps it was simply one part of a much larger feedback loop. That's when I stopped asking who was becoming wealthy and started asking why the same patterns appeared almost everywhere. Until now, I'd been following one country's political system. Then I wondered whether the same pattern existed elsewhere. Different governments had different laws, yet the questions surrounding political wealth sounded surprisingly familiar from country to country. Different languages, different cultures, different political parties. Yet many of the same discussions kept appearing around the world. Every nation organized its government differently, but influence and opportunity seemed to follow remarkably similar patterns. At first, I expected completely different explanations. Instead, I kept finding different versions of the same underlying story. Ordinary citizens everywhere seemed to ask similar questions about transparency, accountability, and the relationship between power and wealth. Conferences brought together leaders from different countries, but the conversations often revolved around surprisingly similar challenges. Once the examples were arranged chronologically, recurring patterns became much easier to recognize than isolated headlines. This no longer looked like a local issue. It looked like a structural pattern appearing across very different political systems. If similar incentives existed around the world, then perhaps politicians weren't the only people benefiting from the system. I'd spent weeks asking why politicians become wealthy. Maybe I'd been asking the wrong question from the very beginning. Politicians weren't making decisions alone. Every important decision affected businesses, investors, and entire industries. Businesses naturally pay attention to governments because policies can influence profits, regulations, taxes, and long-term investment plans. Television often focused on political conflict, while the much larger economic picture quietly remained in the background. Many important conversations don't happen inside Parliament. They happen over lunch, where relationships continue developing naturally. Every policy creates winners and losers, which means countless organizations have reasons to follow political decisions closely. Politicians were only one part of a much larger network connecting business, finance, media, and public institutions. Strangely, the people most affected by these decisions rarely appeared inside the rooms where those decisions were discussed. The investigation had become much bigger than politics. It was beginning to explain how incentives shape everyone's behavior. The deeper I looked, the clearer it became. Wealth follows incentives, and incentives influence far more than politicians alone. The more people involved, the more obvious another question became. Who was supposed to keep the entire system accountable? Every large organization operates within rules, but rules only matter when someone is responsible for enforcing them. Every few years, another proposal promises greater transparency, stronger oversight, and fewer opportunities for abuse. Yet every reform seems to create another debate about whether the new rules actually solve the original problem. Governments regulate businesses, businesses influence economies, and both depend on public confidence to function effectively. Listening to specialists made one thing clear. Designing fair rules is much easier than designing perfect incentives. Looking back, I realized every discovery pointed toward the same conclusion. Incentives quietly influence almost every decision people make. Politicians weren't the only people responding to incentives. Businesses, voters, investors, and even ordinary citizens responded to them too. Maybe the real story was never about a few influential people. Maybe it was about the system connecting every one of them. To understand why these patterns continue, I realized I first needed to understand the rules designed to control them. Every system depends on rules, but rules only matter when people understand why they exist in the first place. Campaign finance rules weren't created to eliminate money from politics. They were created to make that money more transparent. Transparency doesn't mean hiding less information. It means making important information available for anyone willing to examine it. The professor described democracy as a balance between power, responsibility, and public trust rather than simply winning elections. Oversight exists because no institution is expected to regulate itself without independent accountability from somewhere else. Every new regulation attempts to close one loophole, yet changing incentives often creates entirely new challenges elsewhere. The rules had evolved over time because the system itself continued changing faster than lawmakers originally expected. Good laws can encourage better behavior, but they can never completely replace personal ethics or individual responsibility. I was beginning to understand that laws shape behavior, but incentives often determine how people respond to those laws. If rules alone can't create public trust, then what actually determines whether people believe the system is fair? Trust isn't built by writing better laws alone. It's built when people believe those laws are applied consistently. Every generation rewrites the rules, hoping the next version will solve problems the previous one couldn't. Independent oversight exists for one simple reason. Power is far easier to monitor when someone else is doing the watching. Transparency gives citizens information, but information only matters when people choose to pay attention to it. After reading hundreds of pages, I realized most of the evidence had never been hidden. It had simply been overlooked. Stepping outside the archives, I noticed something different. Most people weren't talking about disclosure reports or ethics laws. They were talking about whether they trusted the people making decisions that affected their everyday lives. Trust isn't measured inside government buildings. It's measured in ordinary conversations between people waiting for the next bus. Every vote represents more than a political choice. It also reflects how much confidence people still have in the system. That's when I realized this investigation was no longer about politicians. It was becoming a story about public trust itself. Most people don't spend their evenings reading financial disclosures. They're busy building their own lives and supporting their families. I couldn't blame them. It had taken me weeks just to understand information that had always been publicly available. Public trust isn't created by perfect governments. It's created when people believe the system treats everyone fairly. Some believed the system was improving. Others believed nothing would ever change. Both opinions came from personal experience. Trust grows slowly through consistent actions, but it can disappear surprisingly quickly after just a few broken expectations. Headlines shape public opinion every single day, yet headlines rarely contain the full story behind complex systems. Democracy doesn't end when the votes are counted. That's only the moment when accountability truly begins. For most people, politics is judged through everyday life rather than policy papers or economic reports. After everything I'd learned, one realization remained impossible to ignore. Individual stories rarely explain entire systems. To understand what I discovered, I needed to stop looking at individuals and start looking at the system itself. Watching the chess game, I realized something. Focusing only on one piece never explains how the entire game is played. Every move changed the options available afterward, just as every incentive quietly shaped the decisions that followed. For weeks I'd been following politicians. Now I was beginning to follow the rules that shaped everyone's behavior. Cities aren't built by one person. They're built by millions of decisions interacting over decades in ways nobody fully controls. Businesses respond to incentives. Investors respond to incentives. Politicians do too. Human behavior follows surprisingly familiar patterns. Economists often study incentives because they quietly influence choices long before anyone notices the final outcome. None of these groups existed independently. Each one continuously influenced the decisions made by all the others. Headlines usually spotlight individuals because they're easier to understand than complicated systems operating quietly beneath the surface. Faces had slowly disappeared from my investigation. What remained were incentives, institutions, and relationships connecting everything together. Maybe I'd been searching for the wrong answer all along. Perhaps the real story was never about individual people at all. By the end of the investigation, almost every face had disappeared. Only the incentives connecting them remained. I realized this documentary had quietly stopped being about politicians. It had become a story about people. Give people influence, opportunity, and incentives, and remarkably similar patterns begin appearing almost everywhere. Corporate executives respond to incentives. Investors respond to incentives. Employees respond to incentives. Human nature rarely changes. Institutions evolve over time, but the psychology driving individual decisions often remains surprisingly consistent across generations. Even around this dinner table, every decision reflected incentives, responsibilities, and opportunities that shaped everyday life. The gym reminded me that behavior usually follows rewards. Change the reward, and people often change their actions too. Maybe politics simply magnifies patterns that already exist throughout business, families, and ordinary human relationships. The investigation had finally answered my original question, but it also raised one that felt much more important. If human behavior responds to incentives everywhere, then perhaps politics was never the exception. Every person I passed was responding to incentives of their own, whether they realized it or not. Some chased promotions. Others chased freedom. Everyone was making decisions based on the rewards they expected to receive. The buildings around me weren't created by good intentions alone. They were built because incentives encouraged people to create them. I smiled when I saw that first question again. It felt much smaller than it had a few weeks earlier. Somewhere along the way, the investigation stopped being about political wealth and became a lesson about human nature. Power doesn't create human behavior. More often, it simply reveals the behavior that was already there. Whether inside governments or around family dinner tables, people naturally respond to the opportunities placed before them. Change the incentive, and behavior usually changes with it. That simple principle seemed to explain far more than politics. I finally understood why so many similar stories appeared around the world. They were all shaped by the same invisible forces. The investigation was over, but one final question stayed with me. What would I have done if those same opportunities had been mine? When I started this journey, I wanted to understand why politicians become wealthy. That question seems much smaller to me now. The investigation never proved that every wealthy politician had done something wrong. It proved something far more complicated. Wherever power creates opportunity, people naturally find ways to benefit from it. Politics is only one place where that happens. Maybe the real question was never how politicians become wealthy. Maybe it was why systems keep rewarding the same behaviors. Change the incentives, and people often change their decisions. Leave the incentives untouched, and the patterns usually repeat themselves. If tomorrow you were given the same influence, the same opportunities, and the same incentives, would you make different choices, or would you simply become part of the same story?